Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin, and today we are going to do something different. Over the past few months, we had a chance to talk to some of the smartest minds in the industry of biotech and pharma, thinkers and practitioners who shaped how we understand drug development and innovation, R&D productivity, portfolio strategy, and many other important topics.
So in this episode, we would like to bring together the major insights and learnings and go over the patterns that emerged from the first few interviews in this season. We also want to highlight the unique lessons from each interview as well. We'll go step by step as a teaser for each episode.
And as always, all views and opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers. So let's dive in. I think it only fit that we start with our personal reflections. So now we had done this for a while. Simon, so what have you taken away?
It's almost too banal to say, but it's essentially value creation about doing the simple things well. You can get ever so fancy with your modeling and so on. I think that was a quote from Matthias Krings from Catinian. But I think it boils down to doing a few basic things very well. And apparently that's very hard. What about you?
I have pre-written this, right? So I actually have very much the same thing. I think when we started the series back in January, I thought we are going to hear all these groundbreaking new operating business models and ways of doing things completely differently. All these AIs and magic bullet solutions. And it just comes down to doing the simple things well. And I mean, really making good decisions. And I think over the especially latter couple of episodes, it really emerged that no amount of technology is going to substitute your bad decision making.
I agree. But as we go in this episode, we'll dive into what are these simple things done well, to give some examples.
Let's maybe start with the emerging common themes, the things that really started to come up from all the guests. Do you want to start, Simon?
I think there was a wide agreement on the decline in pharma's R&D productivity, and then we can debate if there's a change in the trend. But overall, no one disagreed that R&D productivity is under pressure in biopharma. So I think that we confirmed, and that was one of the objectives in the first series of interviews. That was indeed to confirm this pressure on R&D productivity. And then we can debate exactly the reasons and how much is declining or if it's stabilizing and the degree to which we believe or hope AI will be an inflection in R&D productivity. But I think that's overall it, that everyone agrees that it's genuinely difficult to develop drugs in a way that if you want to achieve a sustainable return on investment. I think that's clear. And then we'll have to see, we're only 7 guests in, but what is the palette of tools available to address the challenge for the industry? Because I think we already now see the several themes repeating themselves around, the simple things done well that we will get back to.
I just want to jump into here because I think you will note that we saw it a little bit in the first couple of episodes where we really went this high-level view. There's multiple different ways of measuring R&D productivity, but no matter how you slice and dice it, you see the same trend. So that has been very powerful, at least for me. And then, of course, we started high-level here, but then we started to go into more of the other themes where, yes, it's the simple things, and that's a very broad statement, but what specific simple things, right? And there were things like portfolio management, the R&D culture. We cannot really focus on moving projects forward and have this progression-seeking behavior, making decisions in a smarter way and having the right incentives.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, it's returning to the truth-seeking versus progression-seeking. Everyone, I assume, knows it in pharma, but now it's earnings season as we record this. And you see, I think if the industry could just stop progressing bad molecules, I think we'd be in a better place. But if you go into a random governance meeting somewhere in the industry, I mean, the pressure, and it's so alluring to push the molecules forward, even if you should have discipline and common sense to say enough is enough. This molecule will stop here and we will divest or reallocate the resources to something else. I think that's one of the simple things done well that is not at all very common.
I fully agree, Simon. And I mean, I think one of our guests termed it, I wish I could have given you something more grand, but it really comes down to this. And I think that's a really big takeaway. I will tie it up a little bit to, it's a little bit something in the spirit of our podcast, right? Where we both come from different parts of the organizations. And I think that's something that keeps popping up no matter what guest we talk to. There's this need to really break down the silos and for people to work together. And I think Kelvin here, he actually mentioned it nicely, is that if you think about how you run your portfolio and portfolio management, right? It's a function where all different parts of the organization should come in to really shine an objective light about how things are. And that takes the entire organization. This need for people to just talk and look at things objectively together. It's something that, I I don't think we had a guest on this podcast that didn't say the same thing.
I agree on that. Now, as you speak, I reflect that what is it that then derails all the common sense thinking and the simple things done well? And I think now again, getting back to earnings season, that you have every quarter, at least in the public companies, you need to go and entertain your investors and the public about how well are you doing, what happened over the last 90 days. And I think Matthias Krings, he also said the first thing to figure out when you initiate the strategy process would be to understand, okay, is this a public or private company? Because you might see the world differently. And I think that's maybe a mental note for us, that we should try to get some executives from private companies to see and compare and contrast. Do private companies have better conditions for them to do the simple things well? Long-term thinking, strategic capital allocation, and so on. I'm not sure that's the case, but if you take a random public company, is it because of the public conditions and the public scrutiny that it's difficult to do the simple things well? You also have, of course, the tenure of leaders out there is relatively short, often compared to drug development cycle, right, in terms of years. So is that maybe the reason that it's difficult to do the simple things well? And that was by design, we haven't invited guests that are executives in larger or in public companies as such. We wanted to invite people with a sort of an independent view, not tainted by being exactly in that atmosphere of a public company. So I think that's maybe also to try to dig deeper, because it must be maybe something in the organizations or the environment in which the companies operate that makes it difficult.
I think that's an idea for a future episode, right? I think we should see what are the differences. But in public companies, it's so easy to get derailed from what your objective is, because you have this earnings season, you have all these things that keep popping up. So it's so easy to just get distracted by, okay, now I have to look at this thing, now I have to look at this thing. And now we suddenly forgot about, there's this future in 10 years that I've just given up over this small thing right here, right there. So I think that's something we should explore. And I think that's an idea for a future episode.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then I think we also have an elephant in the room around the guests that we've lined up here, talking about diversity. That, we actually, from the very beginning, when we planned the list of guests, the people we approached and reached out to, and we basically sent the same introduction to what we are doing. So we sent, roughly the same amount of invites to women and men in the industry. And I think it's maybe too early to make any statistics on it, but I think the response rate has been a lot higher for men out there. We have very experienced executives that are females lined up that we'll release in future episodes. But I think that's something that's also maybe actually striking me when we talk about leadership and value creation and team diversity. I was just surprised, and I don't know if it's a significant result yet, but we've had more men self-inviting for the podcast than we have had responses from women in executive positions. So I think that's quite striking. And just to be clear, we haven't had any guests on the podcast that invited themselves.
But here I will actually ask the listeners for feedback. Please let us know if there is anything specific you think we could be doing better.
Yeah, but I think that's something where we can still do better. So we'll try our best. But send your feedback. We're happy to learn more, or also take suggestions going forward. And also maybe it's a good time also maybe to thank the first lineup of guests we had, because when we reached out to the first guest, we had nothing. We had a flyer with an idea, and I think so we want to really express our gratitude that so many people unconditionally said, yes, this is a very important project you have here. We would like to contribute. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Martin, but let's start our speed round of going through the key takeaways from each guest we had. So let's start with Jack Scannell, our first guest. What did you take away from that conversation?
There was many interesting things that Jack said, but I'm just going to say one very practical one, and that is the crowding in the pharmaceutical industry. I think, as he mentioned, the advice for the leaders was don't be the 53rd RAS program out there. And I think that's a very practical advice, is be aware of your competitive landscape. And at some point, yes, you can say, I still believe in my program, I'm progressing with it, but there's also a bound of rational decision making where you could maybe say, unless I have something great to add, maybe I shouldn't be the 53rd one in the line. What about you?
No, definitely. And then I think we also discussed probability of success and risk. And I think it was a good reminder that when we look at PTRS benchmarks, risk benchmark for the industry, we should remember that the historical probability of success is a mix of the intrinsic quality of the molecules and the quality of the decision making. Again, going back to progression seeking behaviors. So if you progress bad molecules, that will also, of course, be captured in the benchmark. So that's maybe also a reminder that decision quality is part of improving R&D productivity, no matter how you look at it. So that was one thing. And then, of course, the predictivity of models and relevance of disease models, and how important just moving the needle a little bit would have tremendous quantitative impact on potentially R&D productivity. But it's also hard to do something about, because there's not so much appetite for investing and coming up with new disease models. Is there one thing you want to, if there's a listener who have not heard that conversation with Jack Scannell, would be the one-liner pitch for listening to that?
The work Jack did speaks for itself, right? He is the pioneer of the Ehrum's law. He really coined the trend of productivity going down. I think there's many memorable things, and I think if you want to learn more about R&D productivity, that's the episode to listen to.
Yeah, I think it's a very good start.
So the next guest who took risk on us was Kelvin Stott, and Kelvin Stott is known for not being afraid of speaking his mind. I think the articles he's putting out there that are all great, the headers of them, they speak for themselves, right? Scraping the barrel of R&D innovation and etc. What did you take away from that episode, Simon?
Yeah, and another title of his post some years back was also about the terminal decline of the pharma industry due to the R&D productivity. I think titles of those are bold, and as you say, Kelvin Stott is also bold. And I think one takeaway is that he encouraged people to be more bold in decision making and in designing experiments or clinical trials. So he actually said that you can get probability of success too high, and the sweet spot is around 50% in the way he explained it, right? So if you're about to start, let's say, a clinical trial or an experiment, and you have a probability of success of 100%, right? Then you're not wiser when you have the data from that experiment. And the point where you get the most information extracted is around 50%. And he has done some analysis in the past. And I think that's also just the value of information concept that he advocates. So I think that's something around being bold in your decision making and sort of crafting decisions and experiments in a way so you extract the most information per dollar, you could say, for that experiment.
I actually really like, now I don't know if you mentioned it during the interview or it was part of the pre-interview, right? But I think there was also it sounds like this very theoretical concept, this value of information, but I think he also led to some very practical applications. As you said, right, if your probability of success is too high, then probably you are not asking the right ambitious questions. So it's a little bit of this indicator of if your probability of success is 95%, you're probably just asking a question you already have an answer to. So you have a room to be more ambitious and go for higher risk. Or maybe you can just out-license that asset and rather spend your money somewhere where there's real innovation waiting, right? So I think there were some practical applications. I really like this concept, and I have to be honest, I didn't really hear too much about it before. So I think that was a really nice thing.
I would encourage people, don't get too caught up in exactly how to calculate. You can calculate and quantify value of information, but maybe you can start just by thinking about what would I be willing to pay for that information in the future if we design an experiment. So just think about it that way. How much wiser would I be if I get this information? How much would I be willing to pay? And I think already there you have like a filter, a way of looking at decision design and experiment design. So I think that's really healthy again. And then you would avoid doing the silly experiments or silly clinical trials where you basically are not de-risking the program.
Yeah. I also really liked Kelvin's pragmatism in terms of you need to use both sides of your brain, right? The left and right hemisphere. You need to think both qualitatively and quantitatively. You need to bring all the perspectives to the table. I really like that approach that, again, from someone who observed the industry for a while and could have brought all these, again, magic bullets to how to solve it. This is where he really focuses his attention. It's like making the better decisions together. I really appreciate that from his perspective. And there was one very practical takeaway. He said it to finance people, but I think it goes more broadly, right? Given all the uncertainty in pharma and biotech, it's absolutely important you don't think about things as static point estimates and there's one truth to the thing. You need to think in terms of ranges, right? You need to embrace the uncertainty. I think that's a really practical takeaway, and that's not just for finance people. I actually, after that episode, I had a small reflection of, if you think about all the uncertainties, it's a different part of the business, right? All the most important things, clinical timelines, probabilities of success, commercial opportunity, all those things, they range. And the ranges can be quite broad. And if you take a point estimate for each one of them and you mix them up, now you have something that might be so far of reality, it doesn't tell you anything real, right? So unless you take really the ranges and you see how they stack up, you don't really see the full picture. And I honestly think whether it's for finance person or anyone else in the industry, it's a very practical takeaway. It's like you have to stop thinking in terms of static forecasts.
Yeah, I agree. As an organization evolves and they become more mature, then you will go from this point estimate or deterministic way of modeling the world to more this range-based or probabilistic way of thinking. So I think that is how an organization should move as it matures. So I'm entirely with you on that. Let's go to Mike Rea. I think the clear takeaway from the conversation with Mike Rea is that he's really an advocate for bringing the commercial involvement in the R&D, in the innovation process to the very early beginning of a molecule's life. And I think that's something that's also very actionable, because it's just inviting the commercial folks into the drug discovery labs or the meetings early on. And that also goes hand in hand with his definition of success, that is the value extracted from invention. So it's not about getting the drug approved. That's not innovation. Innovation happens once you start extracting value from your new drug, your inventions. So I think that whole innovation definition he has, and bringing the commercial functions closer to the also invention and innovation process. What did you take away?
I think very much linked to this, right? He said that pharma is confused about innovation. That was one of the clearest takeaways. What is the difference between innovation and invention? And I think you can also see a lot of companies out there having it. They actually probably think that the invention is the innovation, while that's not really the case. And I think Mike Rea is a very clear proponent of the value is being generated in the marketplace from the commercial performance of your drug and drug launches. And I think, it was in Mike's episode where we recommended the two teams to go have a lunch together, right? And I think it's a very important reminder, as you said, the link where you can really create a lot of value that can be all the way in phase 1, where the teams should start talking. It's not like you just hand over your drug to commercial somewhere in phase 3 and now go, please sell it, right? Then it might actually be too late. He was all about optionality. And phase 1 was actually the critical golden period to be able to create multiple launch pathways. So you have to start working together early. You cannot wait until the end, because it might be too late.
I agree. The next guest we had, Murray Aitken from IQVIA Institute. And I think he's probably the first guest we had that was optimistic and where we left a little bit with an elevated mood, because we had to cross some of the history with Jack Scannell and Kelvin Stott on the declines in R&D productivity. But Murray, he was a very optimistic. He was not all gloom and doom, and he was not into the AI hype. So I think he had a very balanced view and balanced reflections. What did you take away from the conversation with Murray?
Of all the things he said, there was one very practical takeaway. It's very easy to improve probabilities of success. You simply take less risk. Now you can start making connections with all the other guests, right? But it really comes down to what kind of innovation do you want to go with and what do you want to optimize. You get what you are measuring, right? You get what you incentivize. So it's easy to do it, but you can easily do it in the wrong way. How about you?
No, I think Murray has a very deep expertise or deep insight into the broader healthcare system. And I think he also recommended that executives out there think about their strategy and how to operate their companies, that they take a broader view on the set of stakeholders across the healthcare industry. So it's not only you have a pharma company and you have regulators and you have payers, but there's so much more to the whole infrastructure required to make sure you get patient access at scale and also during development, because it's a very complicated beast, that healthcare system, and especially also around the advanced therapy options coming out of the pipelines. I don't know exactly how to do it, but I think we can at least start to think about how can we engage maybe earlier. Murray also said that it's not like a town square where all these stakeholders meet in a structured manner. So I think that's still to be maybe something we can explore, also inviting him back or invite additional guests to put some color to that. And then, of course, it's around, improving productivity. We addressed it from the sort of clinical operations, clinical productivity angle. And we talked about, protocol design, reduced protocol amendments, faster site selections, tighter decision making, also reduce the white space. And he also gave the example from the COVID pandemic and the drug development taking place during that time. That was actually an example where you could get things done fast, but of course it was very extreme conditions, but that was an example. Actually, it can be done faster and successfully.
And we were also planning to talk with Murray about China, right? So it's not just COVID that proves us it can be done faster.
Yeah, and I think he also pointed to the resiliency of the whole life science industry. Now we have all the turmoil at tariffs, geopolitics and whatnot. He's been around for many years, so maybe that's good to remind ourselves that it is a resilient industry, but time will tell.
The next guest we had was Stephan Christgau, a venture capitalist in a company called Air Ventures. What did you take away from the discussion, Simon?
Well, I think it was very interesting to have a venture capitalist looking at pharma and how pharma does things. We talked about decision making in pharma that can become, sort of too rich and too lazy and too complacent. And also in your decision making, it's very tempting to do another experiment, and that takes time and costs money. And the companies he worked with, they're strapped for cash and they need to get to the next value inflection point. Otherwise, they may be out of business. So it's a very different sort of cutthroat way of looking at things. And funding and investments are extremely scarce out there, especially now, perhaps. So I think I like that sort of very disciplined way of really looking at what is the experiment that really matters and brings value if you can only do one, and there's only money to do one. And I think that's interesting, and exactly how we could integrate it or implement it in a pharma setting, that's another thing. Do you want to run your decision committees like venture capitalist boards, and every time you see a project, you do a due diligence on it and decide whether you should invest or not? I think, why wouldn't you? What did you take away?
You saw it at the end of the episode where we were discussing, and if any of the listeners actually listened to the end parts of our episodes, I was very excited, right? And I still am. For a long time, I wanted the venture capitalist on the podcast because, again, I really think that this portfolio thinking, they really have to live it every day. And I think I got this perspective. Yes, they have to think in terms of extreme risks, but that makes them even more really focus on the portfolio, right? Because if you don't construct your portfolio well, it's not about the individual parts there. It's about how they fit together. And I think that's a little bit of what pharma, maybe large pharma, sometimes is missing, because I think we also heard it from other guests. There's too much of this asset by asset thinking rather than portfolio thinking. Very specific takeaway I took from the episode with Stephan, and I had so much reflections after. First, I asked him, right, and I thought the answer would be yes. Do you use DCF models for evaluation of opportunities? And he basically said no, sometimes, but not really. So there was learning number one. But I think then he said something that was more profound that I think is actually very useful. And he referred to these valuations models not really as tools for making decisions, but more like valuation as a process, right? It's a tool you can use not to get to the final number, but in the process of getting to that final number, you can uncover all the uncertainties, you can have all the value creating discussions. People kind of miss out on this huge opportunity to use the process as a value creating opportunity in itself. That's where you can talk to the R&D teams and ask them the right questions, validate the right assumptions, see is there a different path of doing this that is more value creating than the one you already have, right? In finance, we are very focused on the final number. And again, it's not about the final number really. It's about what you learn about getting there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And hopefully we contribute to educating the professionals out there, and maybe especially the finance folks who are maybe not intimately knowledgeable about the sort of the R&D value chain, and also vice versa, the R&D folks are not super familiar with the valuation modeling. So hopefully we can cover that and continue to cover that. I had another point that Stephan spoke to, and that was around, he was looking for cost efficiency in the companies that he funds and how you can actually create value and get to the next value inflection point. And that's, of course, you can say it's like an R&D productivity way of thinking. And R&D productivity is more something also when we discussed the Aaron Schacht episode and the Eli Lilly productivity journey, that it's something that becomes more relevant when you start operating R&D at scale. But still this cost efficiency thinking that, I think it would be healthy to have more of it in the bigger companies as well. And of course, that biotech companies and the organizations that they often struggle, and it's hard work because you're running out of capital. You can see the end of the road. But I think maybe you need a little bit more of that in pharma. I think that could be healthy because there's usually always money to run an extra experiment. So I think that thinking is something that could be brought into the pharma organizations.
I think Stephan, he used this term, it sharpens the mind, right? Maybe in the end, you should still do the extra study, but you should think about it first, right? You shouldn't just take it for granted.
So let's go to the next guest we had. That was Matthias Krings from Catenion, biopharma strategy consulting firm. And I think we covered a lot of ground. We tried to build the perfect company with Matthias and figure out how we should start and how we should start a strategy process. What did you take away from that conversation?
There was one thing that Matthias didn't say, but I think for me it summarized the episode very practically, is if you don't know where you want to go, then any road will get you there, right? And I think he mentioned it very specifically, is you need to be very clear about your goals, what you want to do, and your strategy, how do you want to get there, and you shouldn't confuse the two. That's like the step number one, right? You first need to determine where you want to go, and only then you should start to do everything else. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're optimizing for. And I think one edit to it is he mentioned the true portfolio management means prioritizing ruthlessly, right? So not every good project should be pursued. And I really like the fact he said good project, because even good projects sometimes shouldn't continue. I think I very often hear this, well, this is a good project, but is it good enough? I think this thinking of, is it good enough, often isn't considered, right? And again, we are in an industry where you want to minimize the cost of attrition. You want to minimize the cost of failure. So even a good thing might not be worth doing. And I think that was, for me, something I really took away. How about you, Simon?
No, I agree. And I think maybe also to go back to strategy and strategy process, that, as Matthias said, that strategy is about choice. It's only a choice if it really hurts. And sometimes you have to stop doing things or projects that are actually viable and valuable, but you need to focus and you need to make some choices. And then also about the confusion around strategy. If you say your strategy is about you want to grow your revenue and you want to increase your profits, then you probably don't have a strategy. You just have some aspirations for where you want to end up. That's not how you should do strategy. There's too much bad strategy out there, as we know well. And then I think also around the risk assessment, we discussed the Catinian risk framework with their 500 easy questions, how they approach risk. And I think you can make it more and more sophisticated, your risk process. But his advice to organizations out there who want to do a better job on R&D risk assessment is get started, just be conversant, start having a conversation, discuss risk. Then you can always refine it. So don't be afraid of starting discussing risk with teams or management in the companies if you don't have a perfect process today. Start small and build from there. And again, it's almost like doing the valuation models. That's for risk as well. It's not so much about the final, the PHRS number, but equally it's about the conversation and uncovering what is it that drives risk for a certain program versus another program.
And I think when you mentioned financial modeling, he also had a very practical advice again to finance leaders. Develop an understanding of the technical knowledge of the things you are, whether it's the things you are modeling or the things you are trying to understand. Because he had this nice thing, right? Especially in financial modeling, you are getting to a number, right? Once you get to a number, everything looks the same. It's just a number. But you really need to understand what is behind that number. And that points, again, you need to find someone in the organization, if not multiple people, that help you understand the number. Because then it gives it so much more power.
I agree. And also now we discussed this collaborating across areas and so on. I think I'm struck sometimes when you meet people who've been working in the industry for 20 or 30 years, and they only know their little thing of the entire value chain. I think that's something we have to try to change. And that's one of the objectives with this podcast is we want to broaden pharma and biotech professionals and their view, get a broader view on the value chain in pharma. Because if you just end up sitting there with a model and you only look at that one number that comes out of that model, I don't think you are very useful to the decision-making process. So that holistic view, I think that's hopefully also something that could impact the R&D productivity.
Absolutely.
Let's jump to our episode with Aaron Schacht. Aaron, he was part of the R&D productivity transformation at Eli Lilly, and he was one of the co-authors of the 2010 paper around R&D productivity. And that paper, just to remind our listeners, is basically what Aaron called a mental model for managing R&D at scale. And I think it was a very insightful episode. What I really took away here is that to really move the needle on R&D productivity in an organization, you need that fierce commitment from the top management. In this case, it was Stephen Paul who was leading the R&D transformation, and then he had some very good people like Aaron Schacht and others with him. And I think it shows also how helpful it is, again, with model, because this is also a model. It's not a valuation model. I mean, it is an R&D model and a valuation model for the entire R&D engine in an organization. But again, it shows that models are helpful because they can help you figure out where to focus. And Aaron, he talked about that, okay, in the sensitivity analysis, they could confirm just quantitatively how important it is to seek higher probability of success in phase 2, for instance, and the cost of phase 3 and so on. And also that if you look at it, we say risk-loaded manner, that the earlier phases, drug discovery, lead optimization, suddenly becomes very, very expensive as well. I mean, of course, we know that phase 3 trials are very expensive, but remember, to get one molecule to phase 3, you have to repeat lead optimization for so many projects, so many times that it drives in aggregate a lot of the total cost. And again, we now also return to the cost of failure as well, that we don't see under the surface as often, or talk about it as often. But what was your key takeaway?
I mean, it's definitely along the lines of the mental model for managing R&D and scale, right? Is first of all, this kind of thinking of when you zoom out from one drug into the portfolio, that's where you start to see these things where, again, as you mentioned, right, you can easily get stuck on one drug and then you just have one phase one. But if you then zoom out and you see how many phase ones it takes to get one drug out, right, all of a sudden that's a very different reflection. And I think alongside the notes of mental model for managing R&D and scale, he put it very nicely. It's a tool that you can use to link what you are doing in your R&D organization today to the ambitions you have. And I think it ties a little bit to Matthias Krings. Of course, you need to be clear about what your ambitions are. But once you know what it is, you can actually go and back calculate, in this case, what has to be true about what you are going to do today. And then you can also answer the other way. Is what I'm doing right now, right here, is that allowing me to achieve what I want to achieve? And I think that is a very powerful way of linking ambitions to activities.
Yeah, and I think also that R&D productivity equation, basically coming out of that 2010 publication, you see it everywhere. I mean, you see it in investor presentations from various companies. It started a little, but now it has spread across, and it's almost like basic knowledge. If you work in portfolio management or operational excellence, you need to know and read that paper and take it to heart and have that equation in your head as a mental model, because I think it really helps to do the practical changes to your work and your decisions and how you organize and plan your pipelines out there. So I hope we can do a sequel on that as well with Aaron and one of his colleagues from back in the days to hear more about the reflections on executing an R&D transformation and also leading an R&D transformation.
Absolutely.
Okay, Martin, so now we had a quick tour with the past guests. So what about future guests and where are we going with the podcast?
I think we are only starting. And I mean, by design, we took the first couple of episodes and really wanted to paint a broad picture. Where are we as an industry going? Where are the areas that we should be focusing on? What are really the common themes? And I mean, now we summarize some of them, right? But now we want to start to go into these more niche topics. And I think that's what you are also going to see from some of the upcoming guests. Would you like to put a spotlight on some of those?
I think we already sort of almost touched a little bit already. I mean, the Chinese biotech scene, for sure, we have to have a deep dive and we have that planned and scheduled already. AI, for sure, we're a little bit looking from a distance, how we're going to approach the AI topic as part of value creation and R&D productivity. Still, in my view, very early days for AI in pharma, at least to really move the needle. We need to validate that. And another thing also, of course, looking deeper into what shapes commercial success. We're also looking deeper into clinical operations and what happens in trials and what happens between trials in white space. I mean, there's so much we could dive into, and all of these pieces of the puzzle, they in one way or another they drive a good or bad R&D productivity. So if a molecule sits several years between trials on its journey towards the market, it's not good for patients. So we'll definitely keep it broad still, but also take the liberty to go into some really niche topics to see if we turn every stone, maybe we see that it has some handles or levers for working with R&D productivity and value creation that we hadn't thought about.
As we mentioned in the beginning, we will continue to strive for diversity, not just in gender, but also in opinions. I think we were trying to bring a lot of different opinions to the table. So not just different topics, but we want to hear from all sides of the equation, right? And it might sometimes be more R&D heavy. It might sometimes be more commercially heavy. But again, it's very important to bring these perspectives in, whether they are external or internal, wherever they come from, they are all part of the equation, and really want to make sure that we get to hear all these voices.
We highly recommend or encourage that you send us suggestions for future guests, not because we are running out of guests to invite, but maybe we have a blind angle or maybe there's an interesting person out there somewhere in the world that you think we should bring on here for our listeners. So please send us a note if you have any ideas. And please share also what are your key takeaways so far. We are very grateful that we now have some hardcore fans out there who sends us personal messages after each episode, what they learned and their reflections. So please also share your reflections in our LinkedIn group and in our posts there. We see from time to time some lively discussions. So that's definitely part of what we want to achieve by this. That's a more lively and richer discussion on how we do R&D and how we commercialize drugs and value creation overall in the industry. So I think that's it. So send us your harshest feedback. We want to improve this podcast for you. On LinkedIn, you can find us under Cures and Capital Podcast.
Thank you for listening, as always, and see you in the next episode.
Take care.